I'm Rachel Jadika, Fraud Prevention and Strategy Director at Interac. I'm here with Dr. Christine Purdon, psychologist, researcher, and professor at the University of Waterloo. Today, we're discussing the emotional cost of fraud during the COVID-19 pandemic. Welcome, Christine.
Thank you, Rachel.
Christine, can you share a little about your background and your specific area of research?
Yeah, so I am at the University of Waterloo, and have been researching anxiety and anxiety difficulties since 1997. And in particular, I'm interested in the anxiety response, how a threat is activated and how people respond when they're anxious.
So Christine, you've mentioned anxiety. We know that there is an increase in anxiety in general, and I think the pandemic doesn't help that. Is there a specific area of anxiety that you're seeing an increase in?
I think the word I would use to describe how Canadians are feeling is stressed. I think that if we think about stress as stress occurs when the demands of our environment overwhelm our capacity to cope. And I think the pandemic has thrown so many environmental demands, and we're so tired managing those that it depletes our capacity to cope. So I would say that people are very, very stressed, and people have also been cut off from the kinds of activities they would normally do to manage their stress. So playing sports on a team, for example, meeting friends and enjoying the games and company and diversions. And instead we're sort of all in our homes relying on Netflix and our own entertainment with our own people in the home, but we are cut off from the kinds of things that we would normally use to bust our stress.
I know that fraud has an impact on people as well as an industry. And with COVID and being isolated and stuck at home, we have at Interac, we have seen an increase in fraud. And I was wondering if you have any perspective on that.
Yeah, so I think it's a really interesting question to ask about. And people's, are people's defenses lower, for example, with COVID? And I think it's quite possible. People are very, very stressed. There's no doubt about it. And we're seeing that in lots of different ways. And they're stressed for lots of different reasons. Nobody's having the same pandemic. But what happens there are a couple of things that happen when we're stressed that I think could make people more susceptible to fraud than they might have been in other circumstances. And the first one is that when we're stressed, we become very threat sensitive. That is, we are really aware of new threat and we respond very quickly to it. And we're also, because we've got so much else going on, we can become quickly overwhelmed by the idea of a new threat. And so I think that fraudsters know how to capitalize on that. So what they do is they introduce a new threat, like, oh, if you don't call this number and do this, you are going to be arrested. And our thoughts are to want to just absolutely just neutralize that threat as fast as we can. And guess what? The fraudster has a solution. They introduce their threat and then they introduce their solution, which is, well, no, you just follow my instructions and we can make this go away. And I think that because we sort of cascade in our minds, like, oh, if I don't pay, if there's something wrong with my taxes and then I go to jail, this is going to cause huge problems for everybody and I need to deal with this right away. So I think that we can move much more rapidly when we're already under stress in the face of a new stressor, particularly when there's a really straightforward solution that this person is telling us about. So I think that's definitely one way that we can be more susceptible.
So that's really interesting. So then you're mentioning stress. Now as you know, we're over a year into the pandemic. Do you think that people will adapt and then it will just become the new norm and then people won't feel so much stress? Or what do you anticipate is going to happen?
I think that one of the problems with this pandemic is that everything's constantly shifting. And I think that's another factor that plays into potential greater susceptibility to fraud. So every time we turn around, there's new stuff happening and there are new ways that we have to do things. And I think one thing that it's done is it's robbed us of our understanding. Like, there's just so much that's new. We no longer have the red flags we would have had pre-pandemic to tell us this is really strange. because so many things are strange right now. And so we may not recognize something as being, as standing out as much as it would in the past, just because everything's different, the way we have to do everything. And I do think that as the pandemic continues to roll along, we are going to keep being stressed because we still have a lot of environmental stressors. We still, we may not know if our children are going to be in school or not in school next week. And if that's the case, how are we going to organize work? And are we going to have daycare? Are we not going to have daycare? Are we going to get vaccinated? Or are we not going to get vaccinated? So there's just constant unknowns that we have to keep factoring in. So I think that we've probably adapted to some things like working from home. We've adapted to it. But then there's things that are just going to keep flying at us so we're always adapting on the fly.
Yeah, and that really resonates on my side. You mentioned, we can't anticipate anymore. We can't plan, are the kids going to be in school? And that's one of my challenges. How am I going to cope with trying to educate my child when he's at home, and then at the same time make sure that I do work? So then that added stress causes me not to sleep, making rash decisions. So I can understand, and I can empathize with people out there. There's also a mention, these fraudsters are taking advantage of the situation, and they are very well versed in what to do and how we respond. So when someone is calling them saying that their SIN has been compromised or they haven't paid their taxes, they're going to go to jail, what would be the recommendation from an emotional perspective? Do you recommend?
Right. So it's such a good question. We all have a threat system, and we need it. We absolutely need a threat system to survive. It's funny, as humans, we don't run very fast. We don't have great vision. We don't have great hearing compared to other mammals. We don't have great smell. We don't have claws. We don't have big teeth. So we're quite vulnerable. So the way that we survive is that we have a system that is quick to detect danger and mobilizes our body to flee or fight that danger as maximally as possible. And so what happens when we detect threat is that the body, the middle of the brain called the amygdala, will recognize threat or detect threat, and it'll tell the body to produce adrenaline. And adrenaline is a hormone that goes through your body, and it changes your physiology to maximize your ability to flee or fight threat. So for example, it increases your heart rate, it increases your breathing, it redirects blood flow away from your extremities towards your larger muscles. So this is why we might have cold hands, and that's where the term cold feet comes from, actually, is that when we're anxious, we might have quite cold extremities. But interestingly, so those are some of the bodily changes that happen. But what we may not recognize as being part of the threat system is that this threat system also narrows our attentional scope onto threat relevant information. And that's so that we're blocking out stuff that's not relevant to our survival. And that's great if you've got like an actual physical predator, for example. You need to be laser focused on what that predator is doing in order to be able to maximally flee or fight it. But when the threat is more vague and abstract or amorphous, that attentional focus may at times work against us because it cuts us off from memories or information that's not threat relevant. So for example, when a threat about, say, the Revenue Canada is going to have you arrested, we may reference stories about times when people have been arrested for tax fraud, but we're not referencing stories about fraudulent people pretending that you're going to be arrested for tax fraud, because it's more adaptive for us to focus on, from an evolutionary perspective anyway, it's more adaptive for us to attend to information directly relevant to what this threat could be and how we need to manage it. So it's an interesting aspect of the threat system that I think that we don't always recognize. And what we lose access to is information that about fraudsters, about safety, that this could be a scam. That tends to be more of a remote sort of downstream conclusion. And so what we need to do is stop. We need to not make a decision or do anything. We need to get off the phone, step back. You can be guaranteed that if the government wants to arrest you, they'll find another way to come and arrest you. If you get off the phone, it doesn't mean that you're off the hook if it's for real. So what we need to do is stop and get off the phone or stop the conversation online and take stock. And then what we can do is sort of zoom out our focus and bring into account all the relevant information to the situation before we take any action. And that's likely to both downregulate our threat system, but it also allows us to act rather than react.
And that's really good. March is tax season. So we anticipate that there is going to be an increase in these calls, and also reach out saying you haven't paid your taxes or there's an issue with the tax from Interac. I see that every year. We see the types of scam and frauds as cyclical. It really does follow what's happening out there in people's lives and also in the environment. What I can mention also is that these criminals look at different opportunities as well. So we've seen a lot of scams online, and this is not just based on people's emotion, but also a need. So early on, when the pandemic hit, there was a lot of scams, people identifying as having protective equipment and selling it online. So obviously people wanted to protect themselves and then just kind of reached out without doing the basic checks to make sure that these were legitimate companies. And then we saw them that they sent their money to these criminals and never got any of that, any of the goods that they thought they were purchasing. We've seen in the past year a significant increase in scams. And that's as opposed to trying to get people's financial credential. So not to say that the criminals are not diversifying their fraud portfolio, but what they're doing is that they're not just focusing on trying to get your banking credentials. So instead, they've changed their ways. So these criminals, what they're doing is that we're not going to go out and directly ask for it, but what we're going to do is we're going to pretend that we're online shopping, or we're something where we want to deliver a package, but unfortunately we can't because we need your postal code. And you're like, well, postal code, you can get that pretty much anywhere. And then it's like, oh, well, your postal code. Okay, now we need your address. Okay, that's fine. So they got the foot in the door with the postal code, and then they ask a few more questions. And because you want that package, you're not going to keep giving pieces of information. And maybe not enough to be able to steal your identity. But again, these criminals are patient and they know what they're doing. So then they'll go at it another way and try to target you to get other pieces of information. And because we spend so much time on social media, then they'll be able to go and self-serve to get the rest of the information, to provide all of a sudden and create a complete profile of you and be able to represent themselves as you and create, conduct fraudulent transactions. So we've seen that instead of going the direct route, they go around in a circle, and they're being pretty genius about it. And then all these other scams that are out there. So I'll give you another example. At one point, when we were able to leave our homes or leave, the city, we saw an increase, and this was around the summertime, we saw an increase in rental scams because people just didn't want to stay home anymore, but they couldn't travel abroad. So instead, they could go and rent a cottage. Well, everybody was trying to rent a cottage. You couldn't find a cottage to rent, but all of a sudden, there's all these cottages that pop up online, and you could rent them. And if you've ever rented a cottage, you can't really go and visit this cottage ahead of time. So you look at the pictures, and then they ask for a deposit, and you send the deposit, and then you wait in anticipation of that vacation time, and you drive up there with your family only to find out it wasn't true. So you lost your money, you're extremely disappointed, you're ashamed. So they just feed off of that, opportunity that you were trying to get access to goods, go on vacation, trying to find a pet to combat that loneliness. All of a sudden you receive an email saying your streaming service will be canceled because there's a problem with the payment.
Just as you were saying, that the fraudsters they know where our weaknesses are, what our vulnerable points are. And so the COVID epidemic has left many people very isolated, very alone. And so romantics fraud, I'm not sure if that's also on the increase, but certainly the pet scam, people want pets, people want something to keep them company, to enjoy some novelty, etc. So fraudsters know what's in demand and what we want, and they know what they want. They're looking for what we want from an emotional perspective. They're looking at what fixes an emotional need for us. And then, and also they'll also, I think, intersect that with scarcity. So if there's something people desperately want that's scarce, they will, lo and behold, miraculously have a great deal on that. And no one else, so these, people have been talking to their friends, yeah, I can't get a cottage, or I've been looking for a dog too. But then suddenly, oh, look, I can get one. This is a miracle, and I'm going to go for it, and I'm going to act quickly, because if I don't, somebody else will get this very scarce kind of thing. So they're playing on all kinds of emotions, but it's very effective. It's very clever. It is interesting the way the fraudsters know what they're doing. Like, so for example, like with the PPE fraud, it's interesting because one of the things, when there's a scarcity of something that's really important, people are really quick to respond to, oh, look, I can get this. Nobody else can, but I found a way. I found a way around it. And I think the fraudsters know to kind of dangle those kinds of things in your face and rely on that very quick reaction. And so I think people don't realize how successful fraudsters are, that we're all susceptible to their cons. They know what they're doing. But afterwards, I think, people can feel quite angry, quite violated. And I think shame, and I think it'll depend on the degree of violation, the degree of moral injury, the degree of financial injury, or injury of time and effort, or whatever it is.
We found that these victims didn't necessarily report that incident happening. Is there something that happens with these victims once they're caught, and then how do they feel?
Yeah, it's such a good question that I think that it was interesting in the survey that Interac did, that we found that you found that one of the top listed reactions to having been defrauded was a sense of violation. And I think that there's a violation of your trust, a violation of your bank account, a violation of your computer. If it's a romantic fraud, it's a violation of you as a person. So I think that can make people feel very ashamed, and feel like they're not, maybe competent, or I think for some people anyway, it can affect people by thinking, gosh, like, am I not a competent adult? Why did I fall for this? I think it also makes people very, very angry. I think people can feel ashamed, and they are often going to keep it to themselves that happened. And that creates two issues, I think. One is it cuts you off from support from your family and friends, or people you would normally turn to for support. But I think it also cuts you off from learning that many people are susceptible to fraud. We're all susceptible to fraud. And so you don't get a chance to know that other people have gone through this. And so you can go through feeling like you're the only one, or there's something, wrong about you, that you weren't able to anticipate it. So I think it can have that kind of lingering effect for sure.
Yeah, and that's something really good to remember, because they're not the only ones. And it doesn't matter. It doesn't hit a specific demographic, culture. I think criminals are, they don't discriminate. They just attack. It is really, they don't see anyone. What they see is a bank account.
Yeah.
So they are
Yeah.
targeting everyone. And that's why we find at Interac it's really important that victims do report the fraud. When I talk to law enforcement, and I talked also to the Canadian Centre for Anti-Fraud, is that we can't do anything if we don't know the scope of the problem.
Right.
So that's why
Right.
it's really important.
Rachel, I know Interac works closely with law enforcement and the Canadian Anti-Fraud Centre. What does that look like, and how does Interac work with these organizations?
The way that we work with them is that we provide fraud education, awareness, and training, and not only to law enforcement so that they can better be equipped to investigate, but also when they're doing community outreach. So when you have an event and then they talk about fraud, so there was Fraud Prevention Month in March, and all other opportunities where they go in the community and they share what we provide, the type of insight and information that we provide for them to share with the audience. So it could be a specific demographic, an age group. So that's the kind of information that we share, and back and forth, because also in my conversations with law enforcement, they are able to tell me in terms of trends what they're seeing depending on where they are. So I know that one side, if we look at the East Coast, will be targeted often by a different type of scam than the West Coast. And then in between, it kind of crosses over. There's a bit of a mix there. So we're able to tailor the information and also the type of fraud mitigation that we do internally at Interac to be able to combat those types of fraud. From my perspective, just out of curiosity, I'd be interested in knowing what goes on to a criminal's mind, right? Like you knowingly, inflict harm on people you don't know. So what's your reasoning to continue? Is it, obviously there's greed, but is it because, it's for them, they either do that or they don't feed their family. So they can justify it.
I think it's varied, but I do think that there's an objectification of the person they're trying to defraud. And they may be working from a country that's not as prosperous. And so, them defrauding you of $200-300, they think, you've got so much wealth compared to what they're used to, that this is hardly even a fraud. This is chump change for you. So there may be that. It's also a way for them to feed their families. And I think probably too, there are some people who just really have a sort of a pleasure, take a sadistic pleasure and a narcissistic pleasure in being clever and in enjoying the fishing expedition and kind of enjoying how clever they are at being able to get people to do their bidding. So I think there's probably a range of motives, but my guess is that one of the most common is simply that you've been objectified. If you're being defrauded, you've been objectified. They don't see you as the person you are. They see you as somebody who can open up your wallet to them. And they're unconcerned, really. They just don't think through who you are or what the damage might be to you.
Ah, that's good. Yeah, that makes sense. It makes sense to me because it could be all kinds. It could be the catch, right? Yeah. It could be because they have to, because they're in a country that they don't have food on the table, and that's their way of making money. And is there also maybe a possibility that you're not face to face? So it's not like you're going into a bank and you're robbing them, you're pointing a gun. You don't see that person.
Oh yeah, I think for sure that the anonymity and the distance, I think, certainly makes it easier. And I actually did stay on the line with somebody who, and I said, why are you doing this? I said, this is you're a really bad person for doing this. And he was like, yeah, you're going to get the call, so you better do this or that. And he just kept repeating his script. He was just clearly following a very specific script and was unconcerned about anything I had to say other than whether or not I was going to follow his script.
Yeah, it's really unfortunate. It is a boiler room operation. And I know that, when you get that call and it's diarized and you pick up the phone and it's like, oh my God. And they're like, yep, okay, this is what you have to do. Give me your SIN number, give me your, and then if you hang up, the call goes to someone else. So it's just, it's like a lottery. Eventually you're going to hit that jackpot.
And one thing they do is, so if it's something that appears like as a web page or an email, they actually will deliberately include spelling mistakes. And that's because it helps them screen. So if somebody who overlooks spelling mistakes responds, that's somebody who might be in a position where they're more susceptible to fraud. So check for spelling mistakes and use that as a guide, I think, is something else to consider.
It's interesting what you just said, because we found that in phishing emails, there's less spelling mistakes. And we attributed that to, in my case anyways, to Google Translate having refined their translation. So, oh, that's good. That's interesting. So it is possible. Yeah, it's kind of a way to identify which ones might not be paying attention.
That's right. Yeah. My husband's a copy editor, so that's one reason that I'm sensitive to spelling mistakes.
Okay, so there may be someone watching who's been a victim of fraud or knows someone who's experienced fraud. What would you say to them specifically?
First, I think I would want to avoid the use of the word victim. I think that this is a person who's been defrauded. I think because victims sort of suggest that there is something about them. Maybe it's that the way we use that word in society suggests that there's something about them that caused them to be a target. And in fact, we're all susceptible to fraud. So the first thing I'd say is you're not a victim. You're a person who's been defrauded. And the second thing I would say is the fraudsters know what they're doing. They take advantage in lots of ways. It's important for you to reclaim your control. And that might be by educating your friends and family about what this scam was like and what they can do to prevent it. And also just making your resolutions as to what you can do in the future to avoid falling into that or other kinds of traps that fraudsters take. So I think what's important is to find ways of taking back control, and also not generalizing it to a personality weakness or stupidity or anything. These fraudsters know what they're doing. They know how to take advantage of us, and we're all susceptible. It's okay to let it go. It's okay to move past it, and to not treat it as if it's a defining experience. Of course, that becomes harder. The more the person has given away of themselves, the harder it might be to kind of work through it. I think that if somebody is still finding, months after they've been defrauded, it's still affecting them in important ways, I think that suggests that there's kind of a stuck point about it, and it might be an opportunity to speak with a mental health professional who can help you work through that stuck point. But I think it's also encouraging to recognize that we can also come through those things. We can come through them stronger and more aware and than we were before, and we can move on from it.
Yeah, but it's a good point that you've made, Christine, to say that you shouldn't call them a victim. And I think that's something I do all the time. It's like, well, they were victimized, or it's victim, and it has that negative connotation to it that they allowed this to happen almost, which is not true, because it can happen to anyone. So in terms of what would I say to someone who's been defrauded, I think there's nothing wrong with speaking up. I think reporting it is the first thing that should happen, so that law enforcement can do something about it, because they can't act on something they don't know. And another tip would be talk to people about it. Share your experience, because there's other people out there that have either suffered the same thing or might be going down that same path of, I'm looking also for a scarce item, and I've looked online, and it's interesting that it's available. I was just going to send money. Okay, that's good. So that you share with friends and family your experience and what to look for, because you can think back and go, where did I go wrong? Or maybe I should have talked about it. So I think really those two things are what you can learn from from this experience. Christine, is there anything that you can think of right now, like as you're talking about anxiety, getting back to normal or not going back to normal?
I think that once most people are vaccinated, I think that things could start to return to normal. But what I foresee is that there'll be, and you will know more about this than I do, but I foresee a lot of travel scams in our future, because travel is the one thing people are going to start to want to do again. And, nice Caribbean vacations, that sort of thing. I think we're going to see some scams around that people are going to need to be, prepare themselves whenever there's a scarcity of something. The fraudsters will come in and take advantage of that. And they'll take advantage of the emotional part of it, which is we've been, stuck here in our own little worlds, and we're desperate for a new environment, new scenery. They know we have an emotion. The scammers know we have an emotional need for that, and they will take advantage of that.
And that's a really good point. I think we need to look in the future and go, what's going to be the next scam, and anticipate really where those criminals are going to focus on, and then be sure that we are mentally prepared, but also we're aware that, we might be the next one being targeted. Dr. Purdon, this has been very insightful. Thank you so much. Before we wrap it up, do you have one takeaway that you want to share with me?
I would say my takeaway would be we're all susceptible to being defrauded, and that we always should take a mental step backward and take a breath before we take any decisions.
Thank you once again.
My pleasure. Thank you.